Hello and welcome to episode 36 of React Native Radio. Today on our panel we have Ali Najafizadeh.
Hello guys.
Peter Pikarczyk.
Hey everybody.
Kevin Old.
Hello.
And Nofel Kadum.
Hi guys.
And I'm your host, Nader Dabbit. So today we have James Montemango on from Xamarin and Microsoft. So James, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's super exciting to be here. We've been working a little bit to try to schedule everything. So I'm glad it all worked out. So I'm super happy to be on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And, from what I understand from talking to a lot of React Native developers or people interested in React Native, they're also looking at other options that are similar to React Native. And Xamarin's one of the ones that always comes up. So I'm really looking forward to discussing Xamarin and, finding out, what all you can do with it, with the platform.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been doing it for over 5 years with Xamarin, building apps. So, and anything, I'm an open table of anything you want to ask me.
Yeah. Well, before we get into Xamarin in particular, I guess, can you tell us about how you got into programming?
Yeah, sure. So, programming in general. Yeah. So I actually was lucky enough. So I turned 30 this year. So about 15 years ago, I was lucky enough to have in high school, having a math teacher that also was into programming, just C++ programming, basic programming. And he taught a programming class in our high school. And I was part of the nerds, video games, I was a golfer, but most of the time just nerding out, doing LAN parties, hanging out with my friends, playing games. And they got all into programming and they were starting to build basic games for their calculators and things like that. And I was like, I want to do this. And I was a huge math nerd. I loved it. And I jumped right into C++ and I started building all these text adventures and all these games. I learned some Turbo Pascal, really got into C++. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to build video games professionally for a living. And I grew up in Ohio, and there's no schools up there for game programming or really a lot of software in general. So I moved my entire life down to Phoenix, Arizona, and I went to UAT, which is a game school, University of Advancing Technology down in Tempe. And I decided I was going to be a game programmer and worked and learned a whole bunch of things. I did a lot of Java, did a lot of C++, a lot of just MISC games. This is 2005, 2006. And I got an internship at school at a small game studio working on Xbox 360 games. So I did that for a few years. And I decided that I hated video games and I hated creating video games. So then I wrote printer software for Canon. So that's what I did. But what was interesting during that time is that I kind of grew out of that C++, Java tooling. And one of my instructors in college introduced me to C#. And I simply fell in love. It was almost like that first time you write Hello World in any programming language where you write it and it just makes sense. You're like, this is all I ever want to do. And I found C#, probably just the same thing for if you're doing HTML and JavaScript, you're writing, you're like, oh, this language gets me, right? It's like you have that connection with something. And I found C# during that time and it's all I ever wanted to do. So that was my introduction to programming, kind of through the stages of just command line to games to desktop applications for a long time.
And for someone that is not familiar with Xamarin, can you kind of give a quick pitch of what it does and why people use it?
Sure. So, I'll tell you my story. It's like I was working at Canon for a long time writing printer software. And I went to a big conference actually at the Microsoft campus up in Redmond. And, Windows Phone was coming out and Android and iOS had been out for a little bit. And as a C# developer, I didn't know that you would even be able to write iOS or Android apps. So I went to this conference and I came back all energized about Windows Phone. Windows Phone. And even though I was an Android user, but I could build apps on a phone and I got real excited. So I quit my job and I took another job at a startup in Seattle building mobile apps. And they told me, they said, we're going to CES, which is the big consumer electronics show. And they said, we have 2 months and we need an iOS, Android, and a Windows Phone app. And they all have to be native. They have to be beautiful. We're releasing new hardware and these need to integrate into our ecosystem. And I, had no idea. I went back to my office and I was like, what am I going to do? And one of my coworkers, Austin, he introduced me to the Mono project, which was open source implementation of .NET. And for people that don't know .NET, think of it like JavaScript is this huge library of stuff, right? And .NET is this .NET framework. Then you have all this just good, amazing stuff. And what Xamarin does is it's a platform. It's multiple products. It was a company that was acquired by Microsoft, but the Xamarin platform specifically enables any C# or F# developer to build purely native apps across iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows, and share code across all of those platforms. But at the same time, that native part of it is that you're creating a native user interface for iOS and for Android, and you get 100% API access, 100% in C#. So what we do with that is, think of that you have the huge iOS and Android and Mac libraries, and we create C# bindings around every single one of those. And then we add C# features like async await, lambdas, events, delegates. So what's cool about that is, let's say you need access to MapKit or core location or iBeacons or something like that in iOS. You have access to it, but you write it all in C# and you access it just like a C# property or class, which is really cool. And then Xamarin compiles down into native, ARM bytecode, things that are running natively on each platform. So there's no cross compile, there's no transpiling, there's no, magical things running at all. You essentially have a native application, and you have our mono runtime that's embedded into the application to execute your .NET code. So I found it 5 years ago at this startup, and I fell in love with it. I fell in love mostly with Android. I'm a huge Android fanboy, nerd. I think it's a crazy, awesome platform. And I just love having access to everything that you can do in it. And yeah, I've been doing that now for 5 years, and I've shipped about 70 apps across the different app stores total. If you count like a single app as 3 or 4 apps, right?
So, and now you kind of like, how did you become one of the people that actually works on Xamarin? I mean, so you kind of like really, really fell in love with it, and you were working with it. So I guess maybe you kind of started contributing to it, or?
You would think that, right? You would think that I fell in love with it and got into it. I like to consider myself a mid to high level developer. Like I like that things just work. I don't want to always know how they work. So when I give presentations on how Xamarin works, we get down to, all right, we take your C#, we compile it down into an intermediate language, and then we compile it down into LLVM bytecode, and then we send that through a compiler and optimizer, and then it's bytecode, and then it's run, that's kind of the steps it goes through. Well, what happened was, is that I didn't really care about how that stuff worked. I just cared that it was beautiful and native running, and it just helped me be successful for this company. And it was cool. I was making apps for this company. We did DVR apps, so connected DVRs, and I built an entire DVR system actually in Xamarin, so entire user interface built on top of Android with it. And I was releasing some apps. I was the only developer. I was designing, developing, testing, publishing to the App Store. I highly recommend that people hire more than one developer for mobile. It takes more than one. Yeah, it's a joy, especially when these are the Froyo days of Android, right? And iOS 5 days. It's we don't have the tools like we have now. It's shipping around APK files via email for testing, which probably still people do. Well, what happened was we were shipping these apps after CES. We were successful at that. We were shipping these apps, and we got featured on Engadget actually, because this is kind of this home theater PC type setup. And I wrote a few emails to Xamarin at the time, just like, hey, I'm this one-man shop, and here's a few blog posts. And about 6 months later, or a few months later, they reached out to me back, and we started talking, and I did some videos, promotional content for them. And then out of the blue, a recruiter contacted me, and they said, we're looking for this role called developer evangelist. And I was like, I would love to work for Xamarin. I don't know what a developer evangelist is, but that sounds awesome. And as I started reading through the role, essentially what a developer evangelist does, or what my role now is as a program manager on the Xamarin team at Microsoft, is I go out and I help developers be successful writing apps with Xamarin, or just learning what Xamarin is. So every year I'm doing hundreds of sessions, conferences, hackathons, user groups, dev day weekend things, blog posts, writing libraries, writing apps to essentially, give that knowledge back, writing blog posts and kind of showing developers what Xamarin is, how to be successful, but also using the tool and building apps still with the platform. So that's kind of what I've done for the last 3 years. I just love it. So it's really easy to talk about it. And I think that's what's really cool about my job is that I get to write apps, I get to talk about apps like all day.
That sounds
and how
awesome.
you create
Really.
and people pay me for it. It's crazy. It's like amazing.
So, what's like the coolest thing about Xamarin? What's the coolest thing that you built that you're just like super proud of, and you want everyone else to know about too?
Yeah, me personally. So it's interesting. For 2 years, I worked at the startup building these home theater PC connected mobile applications. You could go and browse your grid guide. You could schedule recordings a home or away. This was like 5 years ago before any of the big boys were doing it. And that was really cool. And unfortunately, the home theater PC market kind of died down. And one of the coolest projects I ever worked on was actually, of course, a project that never saw the light of day, which was that we built this entire little tiny set-top box. Think of it like a Nexus player, a little Apple TV. But we wrote an entire Android TV user interface connected with apps. We were controlling the apps from the phone with mouse pointer, clicking around. I wrote the entire encrypted system all in C. We worked in C++, and the UI was all in Xamarin. And now I mostly work on smaller projects. Most recently, what I'm really proud of was 2 projects that I worked on this year. The first one was for Build, our Build conference, which is Microsoft's big conference. And we worked on this application called My Driving. You can find it at azure.com/mydriving. It's a fully open source, super well documented application for iOS, Android, and Windows. And I love it because what it does, it turns your car into a smart car, because all these cars have OBD sensors on it. So we connected over Bluetooth or Wi-Fi via these $20 to $30 OBD sensors that you could buy, and you could shove it in your car. And then what we did is you would open up the application, you'd log in with social auth, and then you would drive around, and you would start a recording. You'd read all the sensor data off your car. So like how's your gas mileage and usage and the engine load, and it could read sensor data like if you're hard stopping or hard accelerating, and it would synchronize between all of your devices with Azure on the back end. And then it would do all this machine learning to generate a driving score. This is probably one of the coolest projects I worked on recently. So it generated a driving score, and my driving score was abysmal because I don't own a car. I live in Seattle. I just take a bus everywhere, ride my bike. That was probably one of the coolest things that I worked on recently, because that was fully native user interfaces and shared about 70% of code and about 30% of code on the back end too, which was really fun.
So for someone to pick up Xamarin, I guess they need to understand C# pretty well.
Yeah, so
Is that the main language?
Yeah, so the main language is, I think for me, I've been a Microsoft developer for a long time. I've built user interfaces in Windows Forms and WPF and Silverlight. I mean, you name it, whatever Microsoft sold me, I was in, right? I'm a Visual Studio guy. I was, it's all Microsoft services through and through. I didn't actually even get my first Mac until I started working on iOS apps 5 years ago, and I didn't own one until I started working at Xamarin. So you gotta, C# is the core. There's essentially 2 main programming languages that you can use with Xamarin. We really focus on C#. It's probably the most widely used Microsoft language that's out there. Our compiler's open source, the Roslyn compiler that's out there. And the core of it is that, think of it as you just have to know a .NET language. So C# is the most prevalent, and then there's F#, which is a functional programming language, which is very powerful. And then there's VB.NET, which Visual Basic type stuff that you can do. But almost everyone I talk to is C#. A lot of people are really interested in functional programming, but a lot of people are there for C#. And C# is very much they're all object-oriented languages. So class-based, inheritance-based, interface-based. And what's nice about C# is it's a very readable language. There's semicolons at the end. There's, curly braces everywhere. It's very nice. So it makes a lot of sense. And when you read it, I guess, as far as the language goes, but it's very powerful because it's been around for a long time, and we're coming up on our 7th version of C#. So what's nice is if you kind of think of C# as, well, if you look at maybe a Swift, right? So there's two approaches. Let's say you're an iOS developer that knows Swift. Swift is like a V2, an introductory to a cross between C# and F#. So if you can read some Swift, you can probably read C#. Like I can read Objective C and Swift all day and transpile it into C# in my mind. And then Java, if you're a Java developer, C# came from in a way from Java, because obviously Java was Oracle and Sun and all that, and Microsoft created C# as a competitor to Java, and those are the two big languages besides JavaScript. So Java has some oddities just because of it's going up more version numbers, but then the version you kind of program in Android is a little bit less and things. But think of it that you just uppercase a lot of things in C#. So we start everything with a capital letter compared to JavaScript, which is all lowercase. But I think C# has really expanded past the capabilities of what a Java does, because we have like auto properties. We have this async await task-based programming that's pretty amazing. We have tuples upcoming. We have pattern matching upcoming. So we're really evolving the language. But the first place to start with Xamarin is definitely C#.
And whenever I'm like trying to learn a new language, I always find it really like good to do something like a project like Xamarin, or instead of just like going out there and trying to just type the language in a text editor and run it, actually having a project to be building towards. So like, if you're looking to pick up a new language, jumping into something like Xamarin and learning C# along with the platform is a lot of times a more fun way to learn a new language. Like if you're a JavaScript developer listening and you want to kind of try something new, I think doing something like that is a lot more fun and easier to learn than just kind of jumping into a new language without anything to kind of work towards.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, when I started with programming, it was all because I wanted to create games. So it was this passion project. And I think it's the same if you went to C# or F#, just kind of learning the basics. And there's tons of great, obviously, plural sites. We have Xamarin University training, which is like our live training that we have. Microsoft obviously has great documentations. They have a virtual academy that's free, but you can find, resources everywhere essentially for it. But what's nice is I think there's probably two buckets of developers, and maybe more that maybe you're thinking about Xamarin is, well, three. Probably you just have your C# developer that already knows C#. So they're going to want to go to iOS and Android. So they learn iOS and Android APIs in C# with Xamarin. And all of our tooling in Visual Studio. We also have an IDE on the Mac called Xamarin Studio. So you can develop on Mac or PC. The same projects open. And then you have like an iOS or Android developer. And what's cool about how Xamarin works is that all of the APIs are the same, just all C#ified. So if you have a reverse geo, location lookup on iOS inside of core location, it's the same exact calls, except for we have an async version of it instead of a callback block, for instance. So we've upgraded the core APIs where we can, where you can access it. And the same thing on Android, right? We have all of the APIs, and then we have all of Google Play services and the Android support library. So you can get down to all those APIs. But if you are reading documentation for iOS or Android, or let's say, Android N's coming out, so Google's releasing all of this documentation, all that same documentation applies to Xamarin development because it's the same APIs. But of course, we have our own documentation that's all C# driven. So you can learn, there too. But sometimes, Google and Apple are driving the API, so they're going to have docs before us. So that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess since we're talking about the native APIs, how do you guys manage to keep up with 100% access to all the native APIs? Is that a community driven effort, or is it all internal?
So there's a lot to Xamarin. Recently, everything in Xamarin, so building apps with Xamarin is completely free now, including small startups, independent developers, anyone's all free. We also open sourced everything. So if you go to open.xamarin.com, you can actually see all of our Xamarin iOS, Android, Xamarin Forms, Xamarin Mac, anything that we're working on there in the open. Now, how we keep up, that's a great question. We've been shipping same-day support for iOS since iOS 5. And Xamarin as a company has been around for 5 years. So that's a pretty good track record. 10 minus 5, that's pretty good. And if you think about how Apple works, right? So Apple and now Google, they have a long developer preview program. So we get obviously access to the same developer preview programs, and we work really close with both Google and Apple in general. So we can release updates and new versions and alphas when they're doing it too. And then we have a lot of tooling, internal tooling that's doing a lot of generation for both iOS and Android. And then obviously the same thing's true for Google when they're doing like Android. Since Lollipop, we've shipped near same day support for Lollipop and Marshmallow, and now we just shipped our preview support for a Nougat. But we're getting access to those. And then I would say like our first round of bindings are just like a straight, here's the API, here's the binding. And then we have like a round before the final APIs are released into stable, which we call like kind of massaging, where you can do as much as humanly possible via automation and tooling. But then someone actually goes in and looks at the APIs and they say, hey, where can we statically type things, and where can we upgrade things, and where do these new APIs make sense where we can async and awaitify them, for instance. And a good example of that is in like core image, where you're doing a lot of processing of images, and a lot of things in iOS and Objective-C are hard-coded strings. So we create like enums for all the different filters, for instance, if you want to do a sepia filter or something like that. So as they're going through, we're continuously upgrading those. And it's actually just more than just iOS and Android, because we also offer support for watchOS, tvOS, Apple TV, and Apple Wear, or Android Wear. So Android TV, Android Wear, and I don't know, whatever else. And Mac Sierra, right? Mac OS Sierra, we have Mac support. So we have a large team of developers working on all that stuff. And I think that's one of the nice advantages is I've never had to worry about, a new version of iOS comes out and something breaks or something like that. We have team dedicated to our runtime, to the iOS and the Android bits of it. So it's a nice kind of reassurance.
Awesome.
What do you feel is the percentage of apps that are out and about, either on TV like you just mentioned, or in any of the various stores that are primarily built with Xamarin?
Yeah, I get this question every once in a while. It's like, how many people are using Xamarin, and what's the numbers? That number, the number will dramatically increase now that everything's free. Obviously, the amount of people in the community has exploded. Just the number of developers downloading and trying and using Xamarin over the last few months since we open source and made everything free. And obviously before that, it was a paid company, paid products. We were a startup, so we needed to generate revenue obviously to stay alive. So it's hard to say. If you think of the core technology of Mono, like that we created, and we say we, I mean Miguel and the Mono team, not me specifically. I'm just a lonely PM on the team. I contribute a lot of some code every once in a while to Xamarin Forms, but the core building blocks, I'm not in there. The main unit or the main Mono is like using a lot of Unity apps, and Unity its own company, so it's kind of built on the same foundation. But Xamarin apps, it's hard to say because we have great case studies on all of our different companies and different companies that are using Xamarin. Like you have a lot of tax offices, Alaska Airlines, Storio, Just Giving, Tableau. A lot of these big companies, all the Caucus applications were all built in these in Xamarin. So it's hard to give like a number on it because there's so many millions of apps. But what's really interesting is it's hard to actually put a number to it because we've had millions of people download Xamarin, right? So we've had 1.5 million downloads of Xamarin from the website. And then before we were acquired, we had tens of thousands of paying developers on the platform. And a paying developer is either like an independent developer or that's a company. And that one company could have 100 developers on it using Xamarin. So if you look at like Cinemark theaters, for instance, obviously they have one app in the App Store for their cinemas, and they have a bunch of developers working on it. But what's interesting is that our big plan, what we had for a long time was that we obviously want every app to be built with Xamarin, but we also recognize that a lot of enterprises use Microsoft and C# technologies. And there's just a lot of big enterprises that are looking to go mobile. So a company like Alaska Airlines that wants to be like a mobile-only company, they have one app in the App Store, but they have maybe 100 apps internally that they're building. So it's hard to put a direct number on it because we don't ever really collect that information, right? So I can't be like 1%, 5%. Like I want every app to be built with Xamarin. But it's always interesting because on Android, you can like bust open any application and see kind of if it was built in React or was it built with Java or what libraries are it's using. So there's quite a few apps that I'm always surprised are built with Xamarin. I just downloaded the Bass Nectar application for his concerts. Like that was built in Xamarin. So it was kind of cool.
So you mentioned that it's recently been kind of completely open source, and you've been in the with the company, I guess, during this whole transition and the purchase by Microsoft. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's been a really exciting time. I think that it was a real natural fit when Microsoft acquired us. I think that it maybe was a surprise to some, but there was rumors for a long time and things like that over the last few years of it happening. But I think it was like a great time with Satya kind of as this on top of Microsoft running it. There's been a big change that I see. I go on campus every once in a while, working with the Azure team and the Office team and other teams there. So a lot of people are just happy in general. And I think what it's doing for us as a whole, as a community, is you have all these C# and F# and .NET developers, and we're really trying to unify that entire code base. So you have one piece of .NET code, and that just seamlessly runs on iOS, Android, Mac, Windows, ASP.NET, Linux, Mac OS. It doesn't matter where it's running. Like that's kind of our dream, is you write everything once and it just runs everywhere possibly that it could be, even ASP.NET right on the server, anywhere you want. So I think it was really exciting. I wasn't expecting everything to go free and everything to go open source. I think when I heard about the acquisition, was in on it. When I heard about it, I was like, oh, that's awesome. I hope that they included with MSDN. Like that was kind of the first thing everyone wanted, because there's MSDN. If people don't know, it's kind of a suite of, you purchase MSDN, you get kind of all of Microsoft software included in it for your company for independent use. So it kind of makes sense that, hey, it works in Visual Studio, so you just get it part of MSDN. But they said, oh, you know what? No, everyone gets it, and everyone gets it for free, no restrictions. And I think that's just really exciting because it energized the community. It energized the community to go try new things or fork one of our libraries and then put it in continuous integration. And just if they need mission critical bugs, they can tinker around with it. It took 1 week for someone to build their first Xamarin Android app on Linux using our build tools and things like that. It took 1 week, and they were the first person to do it outside of Xamarin, which is pretty cool. So I don't know, it just was really exciting. And what was nice is that, I think a lot of people worry with acquisitions is, are the teams moving, or are they getting rid of everybody? It's always a scary time. And when we joined Microsoft, we were about 350 people or so between development, marketing. We have different products too. The platform's just one of them. And everyone stayed. Like everyone reported basically to the same manager. We just kind of maybe different titles to align, but things have been going good. It's been, I guess, technically a month or so since I've kind of got my blue badge and my Microsoft alias. The biggest change is probably using Gmail to going to Outlook all day. That's probably the biggest adjustment.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's really interesting to hear. I didn't realize it's been such a short amount of time. I remember hearing about it, and I know it probably took some time to kind of transition over. But so Microsoft has been doing a lot of cool stuff lately, huh?
Yeah, it's like we put a brand new service in Azure, I feel like every day, and then we're working on like just everything you can think of, like this bot framework, which is really cool. And then cognitive services, which are like mind blowing, to do like facial recognition, all this crazy stuff. It's an exciting time. I think it's just an exciting time to be a developer in general. So many companies are doing so many cool new things to just try to get new developers on board. And I did a talk at an intern conference. Like there's a bunch of interns at Microsoft that you would expect at any company. And we got them all together, and I was just doing this session. I was building this little Xamarin app to use Bing image search to pull down like a bunch of monkeys or kitties or whatever. And then I did some facial recognition to like see how they were smelling. And these kids were just like loving it. And then they were telling me what they were working on. They're like building these robots, and they're connecting them, and they're controlling them. And I'm just like, oh man, I wish that I had all of this available to me, 15 years ago when I got started. So it's pretty exciting.
So I have a question. Like, let's say I'm kind of like I know C# and I've done a little bit of Objective C and let's say Java for mobile. Now, what I want to do is I want to jump into Xamarin and I want to start writing an applications. And I know it's open source and it's already fully documented. But what is the first thing I need to do? Like before, like because most of the time people start searching, okay, what should I do? Like, what's this start point for me? Just downloading the ID and start kind of like fooling around just to get everything to work, or there is kind of like a pinpoint that you suggested that I can just start and then it can start me up so I can start writing an app.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing, biggest takeaway that I'd probably want people to kind of that listening to the podcast or even you guys is kind of understanding exactly how Xamarin works, and then taking that and then where to exactly start and what architecture to go with. Because if you just start file new, okay, well, how do I share this code and how does it work? So there's obviously some big benefits to Xamarin, which is sharing code. So if you know C# and .NET, think of it that now you have .NET that can run everywhere across iOS, Android, and Windows. So what we leverage is that you can build a very large shared code library for all of your applications. And we leverage these things called portable class libraries, which essentially give you like, here's everything in .NET that can run on all these platforms. So you put all your shared code that like doesn't care about iOS, Android, or Windows. It's just .NET code. So this is a huge win if you already know C# and .NET, because it's all your models, view models, your RESTful service calls, SQL databases, essentially anything that's not iOS or Android specific. So you just start building that building block out for your applications. And especially if you had something previously from another app, you could bring a lot of that knowledge over. Now, when you want to get started with Xamarin specifically, you're going to install Xamarin. That's the first thing you're going to do. For Android, iOS, and Windows development, you can do it on Mac or PC. So think of it like you are going to install Visual Studio, and it'll install the Xamarin plugin, the Xamarin extension into Visual Studio. So that's like the first thing you got to do is install that. Or if you're on a Mac, you can install Xamarin, which will install Xamarin Studio. It installs all of the Android bits. It installs any of the mono stuff that you need. The only thing you need to do on a Mac is also install Xcode, because obviously that's where all of the compilers are at, the simulators and things like that are. And it's important to know, like, for your dev setup is what IDEs you want to use. So you're like, all right, well, I only have a Windows machine. Let's say you only have a Windows machine. Well, you can create and you can use Visual Studio to do iOS, Android, and Windows. But Apple obviously has a lot of restrictions of where you can run an application, where you can actually compile it, and where the simulators live. So you actually have to have a Mac on your network that we use as a remote build host and remote debugging agent. So it'll connect to it automatically. But else, if you're on a Mac, obviously you can just do iOS and Android development in Xamarin Studio. So that's kind of like the core thing, like that's your dev setup. And, we're using all the Google SDKs, everything's installed for you. You can use any emulator for Android you want, anything like that. Microsoft has these Hyper-V Android emulators for Windows that are super nice. On Mac, I use the x86 Hexam emulators from Intel and Google. Those work really nice. You can plug in a device, you're good, right? So the development experience is very similar to what you may be expecting. Then what I always tell everyone is like, realize that there's two ways to build Xamarin applications. One is, we call it the traditional native approach, and then we have Xamarin Forms. So the core of them, that shared core logic is the same. It's also the same that they each go through their own linker, compiler, and optimizers to build the native assemblies at the end of the day. So you're getting native applications no matter what. The traditional route is building a separate iOS, Android, and Windows user interface for each of them. So you'd use iOS storyboards, and we have storyboard designers in both Visual Studio and Xamarin Studio. If you don't like our storyboard designers, you can use Xcode's interface builder, and it works right there on a Mac too. And it's the same storyboard format because, again, they're native apps. For Android, you use Android XML files. They're the same Android XML files that would be coming from the documentation from Android Studio or Eclipse if you still have to use Eclipse. So you have your resources, you have your layouts, you have your drawables, you have your values, you have your styles, you have all that stuff, right? inside of there. And then Windows is just Windows XAML. It's just Windows, whatever platform you're developing for. And then Xamarin Forms. So that's the one approach. That's where I fell in love with 5 years ago, because truly you have access to every single API, every widget, every API in the platform. And then for Xamarin Forms, it's a library that we created on top of the platform, which abstracts common user interface controls into a single library that you can access in shared code. So that essentially drives your shared code maybe up from 60 or 70% with our traditional approach, all the way up to maybe 95 or close to 100%, depending on the APIs that you need. So what's nice about Xamarin Forms is that it doesn't lose that native bit. So you still have all of your buttons, lists, list views, time pickers, date pickers, and all the stack layouts and relative layouts that you know, but it's in an abstraction. So for instance, a button, right? It's a UI button on iOS. It's an Android widget button. It's a button on Windows. And then you just have a click event. So instead of having a touch up inside event and all the crazy touch events on iOS and a click event, you just have one event that you code against. And then what Xamarin Forms does is it takes that XAML, you write it all in XAML, like an XML markup, and then it actually lays down the native controls. So it's actually laying down the native UI button or buttons there. So what I tell people to get started, to actually go back to your original question, now that I kind of have gone over the two approaches to Xamarin development, is I tell people to go to Xamarin.com, tap on developers. I'm literally doing it right here in my browser. And that's totally taking you to like your one-stop shopping. 5 years ago, almost to this day, almost here, I started 5 years ago. I went to developer.xamarin.com and there was 3 sections. Now there's more sections on there. There was 2 sections. There was iOS and Android. Now there's 4 sections. There's getting started, iOS, Android, and Xamarin Forms. What I tell everyone to do is essentially these are little quick getting started guides. Like here's how you build an iOS app. Here's how you build an Android app. Here's how you build a Xamarin Forms app. And what this does, it takes you through a very simple Hello World application, doing some navigation. So you learn a little bit about doing storyboards and Android XML files. How does navigation work on the different platforms? And what are some app fundamentals? So, okay, is this an MVC approach, or where do I put my resources, or how do I connect these things together? So you kind of learn the core fundamentals, and those take maybe a day tops to do each of them. You could probably hammer them out like in an afternoon. And then there's Xamarin Forms. So you do the same exact thing, but in Xamarin Forms. So now you can actually compare and contrast how iOS, Android, and Xamarin Forms works, which is really nice. So that's like where I say, like, get started. It's like documentation. But if you're like, oh, James, I hate reading. If you're like me, I actually hate reading. So that was actually a struggle to go through. There's a button up top that just says get started with our video tutorials, which walk you through nearly the same thing, but in video form. And then we have a Xamarin University 30-day trial, which actually gives you online live classes and self-guided, like online, offline classes that you can download the videos and learn with class material. So kind of like pick like how you learn best, right? But I always recommend doing iOS, Android, then Xamarin Forms. And then you can learn more about sharing code, right? Underneath it, you'll say like, oh, I want to do OS X, or I want to do some Windows work. Like, where do I go? Or, oh, I need to create some games. Like, should I use like, Mono Game or Cocoa Sharp, or what's the best way of sharing code? So you kind of like deep dive into these little sections. But I'll tell you, that developer tab has served me well for 5 years. And it's where all of our documentation and samples and APIs live. That was a very long answer for you, Holly. Sorry.
Yeah, that's what I'll need. One more question. Like this one should be a very small, hopefully. Usually when I see, actually my question is actually divided in 2 things. So can somebody actually create games? I know Unity is using a C#, but in terms of the Xamarin, is it actually possible to somebody actually start binding? Like, do you guys have a binding to OpenGL or DirectX on Windows Phone? I don't know whether it's actually available, but I'm just asking. Are those binding are available, or do we have to actually bind it to ourselves? And this is actually my second question. Is kind of like, do you guys actually open some sort of like a binding tool so I can actually write my own library in C++, let's say, and I can actually bind it into Xamarin so I can actually use it inside?
Oh, these are great questions. These are great questions. So the first thing, games. So if you look at the core building blocks of OpenGL, We have everything to OpenGL. We actually have a cross-platform library called OpenTK, which is an abstraction on top of OpenGL it's at least for iOS and Android. I'm not sure about Windows, but what we find most developers going towards is Monogame, which is a very powerful 3D game engine and 2D game engine. And this was originally XNA, which was a game platform that Microsoft built, and it's been abandoned by now. But they re-implemented all of it in Monogame. So it's this cross-platform gaming library that supports iOS, Android, macOS, Linux, all the Windows platforms, Ouya, PS4, PS Vita, Xbox One, like supports everything. So games like Bastion have been built with it, Transistor, Square Heroes, Near Avoider, like all these. Towerfall was built with it from Matt Makes Games up in Vancouver. Amazing game. So kind of you can go iPad, iPhone, you can go anywhere with it. So it's a very popular game engine. And then we've done other things. We actually open source a few other libraries, one called Coco Sharp, which is essentially Coco's 2D, but the C# version of it and the equivalent of it. So you have this beautiful cross-platform Coco's 2D, but in C# that supports all the actual libraries. And we have some other things like Urho Sharp, which is a 3D, 2D game engine, and Skia Sharp, which is Skia on all the platforms. So those would be like your game engines that are there. And obviously we created Mono, which is an open source .NET implementation, and Unity has their own fork, and I think they're moving over to ours at some point. I think they said that on their blog. But Unity obviously is all C# too, and they have their own IDE and whatnot. But kind of that they have that .NET level to it too. So, but for Xamarin goes, it'd be Monogame, Coco Sharp, Urho Sharp, those three that are out there, or OpenGL if you just wanted to write it, which would be out there. And then the other question to get to you is, what's cool when I literally say that you can do anything with Xamarin that you could do in Objective-C, Swift, or Java, it's completely true. You can take any archive file for iOS or Java jar file, and you can create your own binding, just like we are creating our own C# bindings for the core APIs and for all the Google Play services and support libraries. We give you the same technology to create a new binding project inside of Visual Studio or Xamarin Studio, and you drag the library or archive over. And there's some metadata that you can create, and we have some tooling around it that it'll work really well if the library was architected very well, or you have to do a little bit of manual cleanup on it. We have documentation on that for like those core libraries. But what you can also do is you can bring in, of course, any of your C++ libraries. I mean, I have people I've worked with developers that have thousands and hundreds and thousands of lines of C++ code in their application. And it's kind of like p-invoking into those native assemblies, if you will. Android, we worked really hard with the Visual Studio team. You just create a C++ library and literally just like add it as a reference, and it does a lot of the tooling for you automatically. And then we have docs for iOS too. So yeah, there's literally like, just bring all the code, bring it all.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, totally.
James, can you tell us a little bit about the Xamarin Test Cloud and sort of how that compares to something like a Sauce Labs or a browser stack?
Sure. So we've been talking a lot about the Xamarin platform, which is just purely building applications. And as Xamarin was growing and maturing over the years, I was there. I joined 3 years ago. It was just the Xamarin platform, and a lot of new projects and then a lot of new products came out of it, specifically Xamarin Test Cloud. And what Xamarin Test Cloud is, think of it like your normal cycle of building today is, I got to build an application, I test all my features, I ship it to some beta testers, or I run some business test logic, and I'm waiting for bugs to come back into the pipeline. What we wanted to do is we wanted to create a framework and a technology that will allow any developer to create automated user interface scripts. So for instance, you have a login screen. Seems very easy. You have some business logic test that says, username, password, and I test some stuff. But what the Xamarin Test Cloud, and specifically the framework called Xamarin UI Test, it allows you to interact with your iOS and Android apps to do an automated UI test. You can say, for the username field based on the accessibility ID, enter this username, enter this password, click the button. Was it successful? Was it not successful? And then you can inspect the user interface. Did it navigate to the page? Did it pop up a dialogue? Did it not do anything? Was this thing supposed to be read? Was it supposed to say the specific thing? What happens if I'm offline? Like there's all these different scenarios that your core unit test, like an N unit or X unit style test, just can't test. So you need to do automated UI testing. So the first thing we did is that we built the framework. And the framework, Xamarin UI test, is a C# based library that you can use to interact with the app. So touch, swipe, press, scroll, pinch to zoom, anything that your users can do specifically. You can mock out geolocation or rotations with it. And then it investigates. You can say, query this ID. And this is really nice because it's the ID of the accessibility token on iOS or Android, whatever you set your ID to. So it's not like pixel based at all, right? So you can say, make sure that when I click login and it was successful, that this thing happened and I was on this page, like that's good. So that is built up on top of a framework called Calabash, which if anyone's done automated testing at all, Calabash is a very popular way of automating apps in general. And they have a Ruby way of doing it. And we support that too. We also support Appium. We have a beta for Appium. So you can write these tests in kind of any language. But what the Xamarin Test Cloud does is that you can run these tests completely for free on your local device or simulator. So let's say you're integrating a new feature, you just say run all of my unit tests and then run all my UI tests. And all your UI tests would just run on an Android or iOS simulator to make sure that you didn't break the user interface that all your other devs are working on. Then you have the ability, and that part's free. The paid part is the next part, which is that it's basically sucks to have we all have our drawer of devices that, need to be recycled. As a developer, I have old Moto droids and all these things. It's so hard to find all these different devices our users are actually running our apps on, and all the different flavors of Android or iOS. Like, is it an iOS 10 beta? Is it 9.3? And is it 9.3.3? Or is it all these different versions that someone may have broke? So even though I'm testing locally on a device or simulator, there's thousands, there's 24,000 Android devices out there. So we built is the Xamarin Test Cloud. And so the world's largest device lab, and has 2,300 unique iOS and Android devices. So they're physical devices. I've walked through the labs in Denmark. It's quite glorious. I will say we have multiple labs, and they're pretty much amazing. Very white coat, very spotless, dust-free environment. It's the coolest thing like I've ever walked into. It just see all these server racks that we custom built and designed. There's all these everything's booping and bopping, and all these apps are running. It blows your mind. I couldn't take video obviously because we don't want to give away what we're doing, but. So you upload your app to the Xamarin Test Cloud, and you can integrate this into continuous integration cycle. So maybe you're using Bitrise or TeamCity or Jenkins or Visual Studio Team Services, right? Any of these out there. I've used them all. So they all integrate pretty seamlessly because it's just kind of command line. And you would say with every commit, maybe test against one or two devices as a smoke test, but maybe I want to run this against the top 40 Android devices. Or I want this obscure Android device that I can't find, or the top 100 iOS devices, or this iPad and iPhone devices. And what we do is we build wide in both directions. So we have, let's say, 100 Nexus 5s, but those Nexus 5s are running 6 different versions of Android, right? And there's a bunch of each of those. So what this is doing is it runs in our Xamarin Test Cloud, and you're getting all these results back. So your apps are running, and you're getting reports back if any of those UI tests are failing on those real physical devices. And you can get into the device logs, you get screenshots, CPU usage, memory usage. On Android, you can get video playback of your device running your application, which is really cool. And that kind of ensures the high quality that your application needs. So there's companies like Pinterest and eBay and Slack that use Xamarin Test Cloud because it can be built with any application, right? The Xamarin platform is building apps with C#. With the Xamarin Test Cloud, you can upload and test any application written in any language, whether it's Java, Objective-C, Cordova, React, anything. Xamarin, obviously, it doesn't matter. You can upload and create these tests. And it's a really simple way of writing the test is we have a REPL, so you can write commands and it executes in the device. But we also have a thing called a test recorder. So you can just tap around your device and it'll create the test for you. And then you can go and do your asserts and things like that on the page, which is really cool.
Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
And does that, and could you test, like, say, a React Native app using the local simulator that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, totally. So it will definitely integrate into at least the native iOS simulators. So that are there, and then on Android, the Google or the Microsoft Visual Studio ones to deploy. I've never tried it like on the React ones, but like if you're just on a Mac, for instance, and you're deploying, it would just go straight to the iOS simulator that's there on the Mac, right? So you don't even need the source code for the app. It's literally the .app or APK that would be run on it. So yeah, you don't need the source code. So you could literally ship this off to your testers, and they can know nothing about how you built the app. They can just run all the tests and create new tests even without the source code.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And it's a little bit different because what's nice about, so kind of getting back to your question about how does it compare to other different testing like a Perfecto or a Sauce or something like that, is that, it's a real physical device lab. So they're not emulators, they're not simulators. It's not a rack that you have to buy or rent that we have to put in-house or things like that. You have access to any of them at any time. And you just kind of get in a queue, and there's different queues as you're queuing up. And you kind of integrate into all these cycles. So it's super beautiful when you go to xamarin.com/testcloud. You'll see all of the reports. Like our web team is just like knocked it out of the park. So it's very nice to do visual user interface with. I can't say the company that I just talked to about this with because I can't say their name. But I took their application and I ran it. Like I just downloaded an Android app from the App Store and I ran it through and I uploaded it. And one of the most common mistakes in Android that I myself run into, but I've seen some other devs run into, is the app compat libraries and kind of understanding the color schemes and how to do button colors. So I ran their app and I went through a login mechanism, and I ran their app on 100 different devices, and their logo was all different sizes on all these devices. Their button colors were different colors. There'd be blue or green based on their themes that were out there. So it's quite interesting because it's sometimes more than just the actual did it fail this test case. It's like, does it actually look good? So you can have like the 100 devices and you can do a visual scan really quick of if it's all working correctly.
So I was just taking a look at Test Cloud, and it looks like you're basically able to kind of look at all the different devices while you're running your tests. So it's not only you're actually able to do like UI testing as well as like unit testing. Is that how that works?
Yeah, exactly. So when I was kind of talking about why it's so important is that you can write unit testing all day, and that's testing your business logic. But the UI testing with the Xamarin Test Cloud and the UI tests are so important because you need to make sure that your UI is actually doing what you're telling it to do. Because it's so easy to forget to register a click handler or to do something, or someone removes some code and it's unintentional. And we're in such a rapid iteration of we're updating apps nonstop. Now Apple, you can approve an app in 24 hours. So we want to publish apps as fast as possible. And Google, and Windows, it doesn't even matter. Just so quick, 2 hours I have a new version. I wake up and Square Cache has updated their app, and then that afternoon they've updated the app again, right? So you need to make sure that if you're doing these rapid iterations, that you're not breaking, especially major flows.
Oh yeah. So since you're talking about the new, I watched Google I/O, and then introduce multiple segment of the app, so you can actually divide it. So and then it downloads specific part of the app as you need it. So it doesn't actually need to download, let's say, 100 megabytes. Let's say you just want to shop just, let's say, one thing. What it does, it just from the web, it basically launched the app and then just basically download that portion of the code. Have you guys have something related to that one, or is just this one is kind of like a brand new to you guys, and then you guys are releasing a new update on that?
Yes.
Because I really want to jump into C#, to be honest with you. I love C#, but I left it alone because I wasn't a Windows user, and I know Mono was there, but I kind of like say, you know what, it's not my time. But now with this, it's excited me so much that I want to come back. So that's why I keep asking you all of these questions.
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, I tell people it's always the most exciting time to become a developer or to become a mobile developer. I think especially with Xamarin, just because, I mean, I've been doing it for 5 years. So I've seen the products mature. I've seen the amount of apps that people are creating with it. And then I'm seeing the platforms evolve. So when I talked about kind of our same day support, what we've offered in same day support is the core OS. So essentially iOS and Android, so phone and tablet, and if you will. And more recently, we've been doing near same day support for like watchOS and tvOS. We have a watchOS 3 and tvOS 10 and macOS Sierra preview out because Apple obviously released all those. We had those within a few weeks. Now, some of these other things that are out there, let's say Google Play services or the support libraries, which are super essential for Android developers. We get those nearly within, it could be within 24 hours to maybe a week or two. It depends on how big the update is. And we do that and we release them via NuGet. So a NuGet is essentially a huge repository, kind of like what's the JavaScript or the Node one, NPM.
Yep.
So kind of think of it like NPM, but for C# developers, you can download and you can install all these libraries like JSON.NET and all this stuff. And we also have this concept of plugins with Xamarin. So if you need geolocation or taking a photo, we have a cross-platform API for those. Now, the one specifically you're talking about is called, it's from Google. They talked about it at the keynote, and I tried to hunt them down. I was at I/O this year. I've gone an I/O last year. It's a super fun event. It's called Instant App.
Yeah,
and they were very...
App, yes.
Yes, they were. As a huge Android fanboy, all of our main Android devs go, and me, I'm just a super Android nerd, so I go for it. Instant App, they wouldn't. When I went to go talk to them just as a dev, trying to see how Instant App worked and what they were doing, we talked to one of the main developers around, and it's kind of interesting how they're splicing the app, and it's kind of you take your app into segments of it. And it's in a private kind of preview right now. I don't know how they're gonna roll it out or what they're gonna do. I think we do plan on trying to support as close as possible, unless it's some technical limitation. And that one's a pretty tricky one. Because the idea is, let's say you're building a shopping application, like you'd only download the browse section of it, and then when you went to add it to cart, it would download the rest of your application. I'm interested to see how it actually works in production. And then see from there. So I don't have a really good answer for you on that one per se. And that one's an interesting one that we were super interested in supporting. So the thing with app size in general is like what is there going to be the requirement, right? So what's there? And what we do today with the mono runtime is like we embed part of the mono runtime into your application, and it's either ahead of time compiled or JITted on Android. And we also have an AOT on Android too. But essentially think of it like .NET is really big, but you don't use all of .NET. So we strip away and relink away anything you don't use. So what gets added to your application is about 2 to 3, maybe 4 megs max, depending on how many ABIs you're supporting and things like that on the platforms on Android. On iOS too. So you get a little bit of overhead and app size, right? 2-3 megs of your application, and some of the libraries that you're using could be big too. It kind of depends. So I think that for some developers, if they were trying to create that experience, I'm not sure how easy it'll be on Java, but I'll see how interesting it'll be on Xamarin whenever we get to it. So I'm not sure when they're actually going to release it, but let me get back to you next time I'm on the podcast about it.
Yeah, sure. Definitely.
Cool,
Cool.
definitely cool things happening in the mobile space. I love it. I just geek out on it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just so many things. It's just hard to choose what to spend your time, looking at and working on, because I feel like every day I'm pulled in a different direction. I want to learn this. I want to learn this. I'm really into mobile apps and all that stuff right now. So I'm going to definitely be looking at Xamarin, and I already downloaded the Xamarin Studio and playing around with it actually as we speak. But can you kind of like maybe talk about Xamarin Studio and like the IDE in general that you would use to develop Xamarin apps? Maybe kind of go into a little more detail there and kind of give like a quick overview of what that looks like.
Yeah, sure. So Xamarin Studio is largely modeled after Visual Studio in a way, but it's focused very much on mobile development. It actually is almost mostly an open source IDE called MonoDevelop, which goes back many years, which is what we used to use, and it's been rebranded. It has all our plugins in it to be Xamarin Studio. But essentially, it's highly focused around being a great IDE, fully fledged IDE for iOS, Android, Mac, and even just core .NET library and ASP.NET development. So if you're doing some website development, you can do it there too. It's not going to give you like all of the crazy, like all the integrations that Visual Studio does, right? Visual Studio is Visual Studio. To me, it's the best IDE ever. It's a glorious personal opinion. In fact, I think it's just awesome, but it does everything, right? And it's only on the PC, where Xamarin Studio gives you that cross-platform development environment. So it's very similar. It follows the same structures, the same packages. It is largely all built off of native components. I think there may be some GTK Sharp stuff in there, but it's almost all native. So it's going to feel and look like a native Mac app. And in fact, it kind of looks, there's parts of it that look very Xcode-y in a way, but it has full unit test integration, property toolbox. It offers the same support for C# that Visual Studio does. In fact, it's powered by the same compiler and IntelliSense engine, which is our C# open source compiler called Roslyn, which is there. So you're getting the same IntelliSense code completion. There's also a plugin model for it. It also has a built-in Git integration. I mean, it's really fully fledged. It's pretty cool. Like if you start modifying a file and you have a Git backend, it'll do diff inside of the thing automatically. So you can do version control, and it's free. So it's part, like when Xamarin became open source, think of it that like when you get Xamarin, you're getting Xamarin Studio or Visual Studio. You pick the IDE that you want to use. So we're making huge improvements to it. Xamarin Studio, the one that you just installed, is 6.0, which is our biggest release. There's a big light theme, dark theme that we just did to it, but the Roslyn integration and things like that are in there. So it's really nice. You have the same iOS designers, Android designers that are in there. It integrates into, your provisioning profiles, your workflow when you want to publish an app to Google Play or to the App Store, to do archiving. Super fully fledged. I really like it. I use Visual Studio a lot because I'm doing a lot of cross-platform libraries that do a lot of iOS and Windows and Android and cross-platform. But sometimes when I'm just getting down and dirty building some iOS applications, I'll be over there just because the simulators are there. And super powerful IDE. I really, really enjoy it. And you can just play around if you just want to learn C# too. So it's just, you can say file, new C# project, and do a command line one if you want to just mess around with it. And it's super nice. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I guess one last question. I know a lot of people are interested in React Native and hybrid solutions because of the ability these days to kind of do the remote updating through like code push, I guess, for example, since, Microsoft actually, has put that out there and it's really great. Can you do the remote updating with Xamarin?
Yeah, so remote updating is in Code Push is very interesting. I knew what Code Push was. I've listened to some of our PMs that worked on it and demoed it off, which was quite interesting. So Xamarin apps work a little bit differently. Essentially, the loophole, putting quotes, right? There's essentially the terms of how Code Push can work. It's a very complicated rabbit hole of how it does work, and is totally inside of the EULA that you sign. It's a little bit different process of what Xamarin applications go through, right? Because it's a fully ahead of time compiled application. You can't dynamically emit code inside of a Xamarin application, right? It's not jitting or anything like that. It's impossible to do that. So as far as Code Push goes, there's no real solution for that today. Obviously, you can embed a web browser and embed hybrid solutions into a Xamarin application. I haven't really tried that. I haven't tried to like slap a Reactor or slap a Cordova app into a Xamarin application. I'm sure it's possible because all the APIs are there. I think that would be kind of a lot for an application to try to handle, but it's probably doable. So most of our developers, what they go through is your standard release cycle of I need to update an app. I upload a new version to the App Store or to Google Play the same that an Objective-C or Swift developer would, because it's literally the native ARM assembly code, the bytecode that's running, and it's all ahead of time compiled. So there's no emitting of code.
Yeah, that makes sense. And these days, actually, at least recently, it's gotten a lot faster, the approval process, especially if you're submitting an update, at least to the App Store. And, the Play Store isn't ever too big of a deal.
Yeah. And that's the thing is at least recently with all the stuff that Apple's been doing, it's been really quick. And I think, that's the biggest diff, right? Is that if you kind of look at how Xamarin apps are compiled, you're literally and really getting to as close to the bare metal as you can. There's this developer, Harry Chung, who did this performance analysis between Xamarin apps and iOS with Swift, with Objective-C, with J2C, with Java, with the different versions of Swift. And kind of what he comes down to at the end of the day is that we're as close as humanly possible to C++ or to just straight Swift development as far as perf goes out there. So that's, you're really getting that native performance compared to something that is maybe, not actually creating an interpreter. It's not, something like React, right? It's like has an interpreter and is going through kind of that FRP type of development. So with Xamarin, it's as close as you can possibly get to that native, because it is native development. So that's there. So that's kind of the advantage.
Yeah, that's a good point about the performance. And I guess that was going to be my last question is where does Xamarin fall into, like, if someone's looking to build a mobile app, like what are the pluses and minuses, I guess you would say, like if someone was like, hey, I want to build this app, it does this, this, and this. Like, what are the best use cases for Xamarin? Like, and what are like the not so good use cases, I guess you would say?
Yeah, so I've always said, in my personal opinion, I think the Xamarin platform is the best platform to build just a single app just for iOS or Android, or for all applications and sharing code across all of them. Obviously, if you're a C# or F# developer, it's a huge win because you get to use the programming language that you love. Obviously, performance, native UI, native performance, native SDK access is really important to us. So I sent you guys over a link. I'm sure you guys can put in the show notes to that perf analysis that Harry Chung did. But you're getting that huge perf win to get down there. The drawbacks, it's always hard. Everyone always wants to know what the drawback is. And I've kind of said the same thing for a while, which is when you go cross-platform with anything, maybe even with React Native, right? So we're always going to be a few weeks behind or a few days behind getting those previews out to you. Like, well, same day support, but those previews out to you and some of the tooling that's there, maybe some of the designers there. And for most developers, even me included, it's hard enough for me to keep up with everything that's going on. I don't need to play around with the latest iOS 10 bits just yet. Like, I'm still trying to learn everything new in iOS 9. Like, give me some time. I think the one thing that sometimes I run into is that there's sometimes there's a huge pool of Java and Objective-C and Swift developers out there building apps. And then there's these subsets of HTML and Xamarin developers, anyone else using these frameworks. And I think Xamarin is a very large pool. We have a large community, but there's tons of amazing Java libraries that are out there today, or Objective-C libraries that I wish that I could just like slap into my application. And Ali asked, and he said, can I do that? And I said, yes, you can. I often just rewrite libraries in C#, or sometimes I create these bindings around it, but it's still a little bit of work that I have to do to get those. And we do have an entire team that's dedicated to bringing in all of those libraries. So if you're looking to integrate like the Facebook SDKs or Stripe or any of these, SDKs into your application, they're there, and they're all on NuGet or our component store that you can download them from. So if you need like AirWatch support, or you need like Amazon integration or any Google, all these things, a lot of it's done for you already. But every once in a while, you find something like, I just want to bring that in. So that'd be like the biggest downfall, which to me, I haven't really ran into that many times in my 5 years of doing it. And if so, I spent a day learning how some awesome library was built so I could rewrite it in C# and make it better. So
awesome. Yeah. Well,
hey, so like in terms of releasing tools for different platforms like Windows and Mac, how do you handle that? Do you put stuff out for Windows first, or do you wait for both platforms to reach parity?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and we try to be in sim ship features as much as humanly possible. So when we release a new like designer updates, kind of both IDEs should get them at the same time. And we're doing, obviously new SDKs, they should be at the same time. And we do our best to ship those features as much as humanly possible. Visual Studio is always releasing its own Visual Studio stuff, and Xamarin Studio is updating as well. So, for instance, Visual Studio 2015 had C#6 support, and then we had to go integrate that. And now we're really set up for C#7 and the new features, so it just comes along for the ride. But let's say a great example is watchOS 3 and tvOS 10. Like that support is in preview today, obviously not only for Objective-C and Swift and any other developer, but for Xamarin developers. And that tooling is available on the Mac today. It's not available yet in Visual Studio because we're still doing some designer work and a few little bits. But come stable release, we try to, as much as humanly possible, do a sim ship on both Mac and PC. Because as we're kind of developing through the previews, it's there. You'd expect like an Android release usually to be both in Visual Studio and Xamarin Studio because there's no real restrictions around that. We kind of figure like, hey, if you're going to do some iOS and you're playing around with a lot of these new iOS APIs, we can get that out first, and then we can work on the other ones. But as far as like same day support, we try to release as close as humanly possible on both platforms.
Okay, great. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get to the picks. So I guess, James, I'll let you go first. Do you have any picks tonight?
I do. I have one pick specifically. Well, two picks. One is I want to do just a shout out to my podcast. We talked about it a little bit earlier. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably like podcasts. I have a podcast with my good friend Frank Kruger, who's actually part of my second pick. It's called Merge Conflict, mergeconflict.fm. It's just a development podcast about anything in the mobile, desktop, web, anything that we're talking about. We've been developers for a long time. And it's every Monday. Hope you guys download it, subscribe at mergeconflict.fm. But my actual pick is an app by my friend Frank Kruger. He's a professional, iOS developer, Android developer. He does a lot of iOS work and uses Xamarin for everything. He built this amazing application on iOS called Continuous. You can find it at continuous.codes. So the word continuous and then .codes. So Continuous Codes. It's a great top level domain that he bought. It's a professional C# and F# IDE for the iPad. So it's a full IDE for the iPad. And it's fully powered by Roslyn for C#. So all the same amazing C# IntelliSense. It works on iPhones too, but the best experience is on an iPad. It gives you full the IntelliSense. It supports Xamarin iOS. It supports our Xamarin Forms. It supports F# projects, iOS projects. And he also has a mode called continuous debugging, where as you're writing code, your application is automatically getting recompiled and updated in real time. So you never actually have to recompile your application. He has an example of a Pong game, and you change the size of the ball, and it just updates in the app automatically as it's running. And it's super fully fledged, super awesome. And it's like $10. It's unbelievable. And that was all built with Xamarin too. So it's an amazing example of what you can actually build with Xamarin, and then go build apps with Xamarin in an app that was built with Xamarin. It's kind of that 18 layers of inception there. So that's my pick. It's amazing. I highly recommend, especially if you guys are looking to learn some stuff, play around. It's pretty sweet.
Very nice. I'm checking out the website right now. It looks awesome. Okay, Ali, do you have any picks?
Yeah. Well, I've been working with MobX heavily these couple of weeks to incorporate it and to remove Redux from our applications, and I'm really happy about it. So I just want to tell everyone that check out MobX, and it's a pretty interesting concept of controlling your state. And check it out.
+1 on the MobX here too. I love it. Peter, do you have any picks?
This was kind of useful. Lately, I've been working on a Tribe rep for a local company here in Chicago, and there's a lot of people using a lot of different phones and a lot of different apps. And sometimes we kind of get weird issues. And sometimes people jailbreak their phones and stuff. And there's actually kind of something cool called Jail Monkey for React Native, and it can figure out whether or not your device is jailbroken or not.
Very cool. I guess, Nofel, do you have any picks?
Yeah, so my pick is Gyroscope app. It's basically an app that helps you track everything about your life, from health to productivity. And they do this by using third-party services like Fitbit or Rescue Time, and they'll generate beautiful like graphs and help you basically correlate different data in your life. And it's very encouraging if you're trying to get in better shape, or if you're just trying to be more productive. And another cool thing, or a fun fact about it, is that it was built with React Native. So I definitely recommend it. Check it out. It's Gyroscope, basically gyrosco.pe, and it's a great application. It looks beautiful too.
Okay, awesome. My picks are going to be, I have 3 picks. The first one is going to be an app called Enki. It's spelled Enki. And it's branded as 5-minute daily workouts for dev skills. And pretty much what you do is you download the app and you pick the languages that you're interested in learning or learning more about. And you kind of let them know what level you are, beginner, intermediate, or advanced. And it'll pretty much send you a push notification, and you get to do like a 5-minute workout. And it'll pretty much teach you new stuff depending on your skill level. And I've been doing the JavaScript so far on advanced, and I've learned a lot. So it's really cool. I'm also signed up for Python and Ruby, which are not out yet, but I think they're coming soon. So check that out. Second one is the Angry Birds movie. I wasn't really too pumped up to see it based on some reviews, but ended up watching it over the weekend with my kids. And it's a really good movie, regardless if you have kids or not. It's just a funny animated movie with some really nice animation. My last pick is a book that came out through Manning Publications that I wrote. It's called React Native in Action. I think we're on 3 chapters on the Manning Early Access Program, which means you can pretty much go ahead and buy the book and start reading it now. And once the entire book is finished, you'll get a physical copy as well as the digital copy. I'm also looking for any feedback. So if someone wants to go ahead and download the first chapter, it's free. Any thing that you kind of see that needs to be explained further, or any mistakes, I'm completely open to hear any feedback, and I would really appreciate it. Okay, well, James, thank you so much for your time. I think we all really enjoyed speaking with you, and I know we all learned a lot about Xamarin.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me. It was an honor and a privilege.
All right. Well, that wraps up episode 36 of React Native Radio. We'll see everyone next week.